Dr. Ahmed was born and raised in Illinois. He's product of our locality, and he's also son of one of our very good volunteer, Seema Rahimullah. So Dr. Rahimullah, MD, is a clinical assistant professor at Stanford University School of Medicine and director of addiction medicine. And he teaches people postgraduate, right?
Yeah.
Postgraduate. He's been involved in the community for many years, and he has 2 kids and, of course, 1 wife so far. And I heard from Seema that he's an excellent son. I was trying to dig something in his past so I can tease him today, but I couldn't find anything. So he's a very straightforward guy, raising 2 kids in the family and a very obedient son. But he has excellent record of dealing with addiction, and also, I mean, he'll talk more about it himself, but he's also in charge of Medina Institute. And he will talk more about Medina Institute, which is totally focusing on needs of the Muslim clients who needs help with addiction. Okay, so I'll ask him to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wa salam ala ashraf al-anbiya wal mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Allahumma alimna bima yanfa'una wa anfa'na bima lamtana wa zidna ilman nafi'an. All right, I'm going to attempt to do this without a microphone, inshallah. What I wanted to talk about today was just drug use in the community, in the Muslim community. Alcohol, drug use as a problem. And so, first of all, one thing to begin with is that addiction exists, or drug problems exist in the Muslim community. And sometimes that's the first starting point. So we work with Muslims in our work at the hospital that I work at. We run an addiction program where we work with the general public. And a small percentage of those people will be Muslim. I have an opportunity where we do a lot of demographic data collection of like ethnicity, race, so on and so forth. And what we're seeing is Muslims make up that addiction population that's open to the public at same rates of what they make up in the general US population. So there's no lack of this problem within the Muslim community. And the question is like, why does this happen? That's the question that usually comes up and comes to mind. And that's what I'm going to attempt to address today and talk about. But essentially, I wear another hat where we've started this nonprofit organization for Muslims recovering from addiction called Medina House. And basically, we've accrued a lot of experience there working within the Muslim community. And a lot of the same questions will arise when we're talking about this problem. And so what I'd like to do is go over some of those frequently asked questions that typically come up in the Muslim community. And it's important to remember our community is very diverse. And, but we do have a lot of commonalities in the way that we're approaching this. So yes, so addiction exists. So how does it exist if Islam says that alcohol and drugs is clearly prohibited? That's the question. How does this like come about? Well, it's a simple answer. It's not an enlightening answer, but it's sometimes something we overlook. Muslims are at different stages of their development. Muslims are at different stages of their practice. We see this within our own lives. If you grow up in Islam, there's no way you can learn it all at once. A 7-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 15-year-old are all going to have different understandings of Islam. You take that same 7-year-old, the same 12-year-old, the same 20-year-old, and you put them in a context where there's a lot of access to drugs and alcohol. They got to sort of work out the Islam, work out the society, work out all these things together, and then you can start to see how these certain things happen. So people are different levels of practice, growing up in Islam, coming into Islam. If you think about the Sahaba worked on their hearts and minds for a long period of time before all these rules came down, including the rules of khamr and intoxicants. So they worked on themselves to a point where they had this opportunity and space to develop. as well. And the beauty of the deen is we have a low threshold of entry into Islam. It's a real low threshold. What takes you out of Islam is simply just denying what brought you into Islam. So we have a lot of opportunity for people to come in and sort of work it out. So, well, the question is then how do these things arise? And that's what I hope to talk about. And you don't even really need like data, and you don't really even need to have this explanation. Most of us can close our eyes and think of somebody in their community or in our community that they know who uses drugs or alcohol, or maybe struggles with drugs or alcohol. If you just close your eyes and think of that individual person, what was their upbringing? What kind of schooling did they go through? What are their goals and their values and their passions? What kind of person are they? What's their personality? If you think of that person and you realize that that person is just one of many people with that similar story, then you start to recognize how problems or issues can arise within the Muslim community, the human Muslim community. So, you know, what I would encourage you to do is think of that one person that we know personally, but we sort of make excuses for and say, well, you don't understand, they're different. They have goals, passions, dreams. They were a good person, or they used to be really active in social service, or it's just an off track for this person. It's just a temporary challenge that they're dealing with for this person. But what I'm seeing in my practice is all of the people I'm seeing are these good people where they're temporarily coming off track. They're just in different stages of the progression of that. So, you know, there's no like inherently evil group of people struggling with this problem. And then the good people are like the outlier. What I'm typically seeing is good people who are just struggling with their faith and with their life. But more importantly, there's a phenomenon, and this is why it's important to talk about it in this setting, is that people who do address this and are successful at overcoming these problems typically learn amazing skills. And it's almost as if this problem can be a great precursor to practicing Islam with excellence, being really upright people in society and serving humanity. So, and this is certainly what we see. This is certainly what we see. So the question is how do drug problems arise within Muslims? Well, we see a lot of risk factors that are associated with increased use of drugs and alcohol, or problems with drugs. Let's just take marijuana, for example, because marijuana is often the first drug that's used, or drug that precedes other drug use or heavier drug use. There's a lot of studies done looking at why does that happen? Like, why do people use drugs? Why do some people use marijuana and persistently use marijuana, whereas other people don't use it, or may just use it and then sort of phase out of it without it becoming a problem? So one of those risk factors is trauma or difficult childhood experiences. So, for example, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and other types of abuse. Sometimes sexual abuse is really just not talked about, but this is something that's been shown to be a risk factor that increases substance use. And this can be a type of abuse that the person who's undergoing this abuse, they don't recognize this abuse as something that is traumatic at the time, but you know, it's still something that affects them psychologically as they grow. And it can be from somebody that is not necessarily outside of the family. Oftentimes it's somebody that's known within the family or within the network. And it can even be from somebody older, like an older child, it's 5 years older or so, with the studies that was looked at. Also, parent-child relationship is very important. And, you know, that's something to continue to work on. But then what kind of parent-child relationship? What they find in the studies is that parental closeness and quality is a protective factor, and the opposite is obviously a risk factor. So like tarbiyah, tarbiyah of our children. It's a very important thing to invest in this day and age. More so important than saving the world is making sure our own households are in check. Our children, raising them, so much so that our scholars tell us things like, once you get married, to start focusing on tarbiyah, start thinking about it. You don't even have children yet, but that's how important this responsibility is. Our children aren't ours; they come through us, but they're an amana, they're a responsibility, and it's an incredible way of getting closest to Allah by really focusing and working on our children, especially in this day and age. But perhaps one of the most important risk factors is just access to substances. So one of the calls that we get often at Medina House is that people will start talking. Usually it's a family member calling for a loved one who has addiction. They'll start talking and say things like, well, we never came across these things growing up. Like, we don't even know what the names of these drugs are. Like, what are these things? And it really feels so foreign, probably scary to them. Well, how do we deal with these things, especially when some of these substances have been known to cause death or overdose death? And it's very frightening, and I can understand that. And that's why this is a little bit more important of a conversation, because the stakes are high. Whereas perhaps 20, 30 years ago, you can mess up or make some mistakes and then bounce back. It's not the case anymore. It's not less forgiving. These problems are less forgiving. I mean, I think it's really amazing that the Prophet ﷺ warned us about this, that he said that intoxicants will be widespread as time progresses. If you think about it, there could have been many possibilities. There could have been a possibility where intoxicants weren't widespread as time progresses. I mean, we figured out other things. Like, if you look at smallpox, we figured that out. That's another public health emergency, public health problem, public medical problem that we were able to use science to eradicate, which we were able to coordinate and eradicate. You look at the World Health Organization, they're able to create a coordinated worldwide response to eradicate these things. So to eradicate smallpox. So that could have absolutely happened with drugs, but it hasn't with alcohol and drugs. In our society, alcohol-related deaths are continuously increasing. In our society, drug-related deaths are continuously increasing. And it's number one preventable cause of death is smoking. Number 3 preventable cause of death is alcohol. Now people are more likely to die from a car accident. I'm sorry. Now people are more likely to die from a drug overdose than a car accident. So if you look at our children, previously it was like, let's make sure they're driving properly. Let's make sure we're really with them when they start to drive. Make sure that we pound on them for the seatbelt and be careful. Now it's like other things that are really problematic. And unfortunately, we can no longer say, I just don't know about these things. We can't just say this wasn't part of the way that these weren't the problems that I had growing up. We still have to inform ourselves about these things and train ourselves. And that's why it's so amazing all of you have come out today. Really, we should take time to celebrate you all for taking time out on a Saturday to talk about this topic, to equip yourselves and equip your families. So access is important. I'll give you a couple examples, because I think this is a really important part to understand why we've come to the point we've come to, and how things perhaps are going to continue to occur. Because let's take the opioid epidemic for one reason, for one example. This is constantly in the news now, so we hear about it over and over again in some way or some form. A doctor being sued about it, a lawsuit against a pharmaceutical company, overdose deaths of somebody in some community rising. So if you look at the opioid epidemic, well, how did that start? That started with increased prescribing of opioids. Prescribing of opioids just quadrupled in a very short period of time, because the latest science basically said It's okay. It's not addictive. Let's treat pain. That's the more authentic pressing problem, is treating pain, not the addiction, not just prescribing opioids. So through marketing and bad science, opioids flooded the market. So we have this increase in opioids where they weren't getting these opioids off the street. They were getting them from friends, family members, from leftover opioids, because they were just everywhere in the medicine cabinets and all over. And with that increase in prescribed opioids, we'd see increase in opioid overdose death. And with that increase in prescribed opioid, we see increases in checking into rehab for prescribed opioid addiction. Then there's a second wave where after that, then there's a heroin addiction. A rise in heroin overdose deaths. And now we're in the phase that we're in right now, which is fentanyl. Fentanyl is the buzzword now. Now we're seeing a huge rise in fentanyl opioid. Fentanyl is an opioid, so a huge rise in fentanyl overdose deaths. So the point I'm trying to make is that this increase in access is what preceded this increase in overdose death in society. It's almost like an experiment that you can see that simply injecting opioids or increasing opioids in a society, the whole society in its entirety starts suffering with this problem. So similarly within our communities, once we start seeing this, because we're not immune to this broader community, this masjid, mashallah, there's so many amazing things that happen here. And despite our best efforts, which are very important, we keep doing all these efforts to integrate children into the masajid, integrate everybody into the masajid, and provide opportunities for people to seek help in the masajid. All these things are wonderful. We should continue to do them and continue to expand on them and continue to strengthen them. But then also just keep in mind, keeping an eye on those things that put us at risk are very important as well. Keeping an eye on those things that put us at risk are important as well to cut off. Now, we also see this phenomenon in our work in the Muslim community where you have these family networks that sort of box off and kind of shelter from the outside community to some degree. But then they have substance use going on within their family or friend network or within their communities. And so beware of that we kind of box off the larger community, and then we keep people within, let's say, our family network and or within our cultural network. And for some reason that social circle has substance use problems within it. We're almost like caging them into a problem with drugs. So keep that in mind as well. So that's a roadblock that we see, a pitfall that we see. But in general, doing what you can to wall people off of access to this is a good thing. And there's many strategies to do this. One is going back to the parental closeness and quality, is to really work on developing a relationship with the child. Feeding, clothing, housing, mashallah, like that's great. But then also like having a conversation with the child, having a pulse on the child, giving them a space to just speak and be who they are, and sort of kind of emphasizing and prioritizing, allowing them to have those open lines of communication and not rush to judgment or not rush to criticize, so that you can prioritize having those open lines of communication so you can get that authentic person. Like, who is this person? What are their interests, and what are they doing in school? What's happening in school? And that's another thing to keep in mind. Many people will start substances through access to school. All right, so keeping in contact with your children to get a true understanding of what's going on with them. And then there's other ways to decrease access, which is to just decrease time. So time to free time. So in other words, this idea of getting people involved in a lot of activities is incredibly important. Exercise is incredibly important. Exercise has been shown to help people reduce drug use, recover from drug problems and addiction, reduce withdrawal symptoms in animal models, but then also for kids, for people that are starting to experiment with drugs, exercise has been shown to reduce that phenomenon in animal and human studies. So essentially, there's one model, which was the Icelandic model of prevention, adolescent prevention for substance use, which they incorporated exercise into to help prevent substance use in their community. So exercise is an incredibly important protective factor, or a factor that can help reduce substance use problems. So keeping people's times occupied, keeping people's time occupied is important with children. Of course, not to the extent that we're sort of stressing them out and causing another problem, but in a healthy, balanced way. And then finally, one of the risk factors I'll discuss before I talk a little bit more about addiction. A lot of these risk factors can be found online. Risk factors for substance use, risk factors for marijuana use, protective factors for substance use, protective factors against marijuana use. One other factor I wanted to talk about is spirituality and religious participation. So there are numerous studies that show that involvement in religious participation and measures of spirituality are protective against substance use problems. So these efforts to integrate our children into the masajid and the programs for the masajid, even if they're just recreational, followed by some sort of with spiritual role models and people involved in the process is absolutely important, absolutely key. Let's keep that up, inshallah. Keep building that infrastructure and keep going along those lines. But yeah, it's been shown, and these are studies not within the Muslim community, but just in the general community, which show that doing these things are incredibly beneficial in protecting against substance use and experimenting with substance use. And then also on that note, even when drug problems arise, integrating spirituality into the recovery process has been shown to be very important and helpful in getting people off of substances. So I'm going to pause here and see if we have any questions before I go into what do we do. We talked about the fact that addiction exists or drug problems exist within the Muslim community. We talked about what are some risk factors, some reasons why this arises in the Muslim community and in the community in general. And before I go into, well, what do we do when there is a drug problem? How do we navigate that complicated situation? Before I jump into that, I'd just like to pause because it's a little bit of a different conversation. I wanted to see if there's any questions, inshallah. Okay, great. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm curious. You mentioned a lot of risk factors.
Mm-hmm.
In the cases that you work with people, are there patterns that you see amongst those risk factors that tend to come up more often than not?
Absolutely. In the Muslim community or a general population?
Muslim community.
Okay. Yeah, I'll say that that's a good question. Since you asked the question, I'll give you the answer from that. I think in a lot of ways we do absolutely see these archetypal responses within the Muslim community. One risk factor that we see is that there was a study done on in the Hispanic community which looked at substance use risk amongst people who their parents are more the children are more acculturated to American society than the parents. And oftentimes we'll get a call and we see people who will have this sort of feeling that they're just not on the same frequency. Do you want me to bring it closer?
You can come closer.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
Is this better? Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. So that's one. And then oftentimes unresolved, like mental health problems, stigma preventing people from getting treatment, and then focus on sort of covering up the problem as opposed to finding help for the problem. So, you know, shame and stigma are, I'm sorry, shame is an important emotion. Modesty is an important emotion. It's an important and painful emotion that motivates societies to achieve a goal. Oftentimes, if we don't look at the objective of shame to lead to a goal, and we just focus on shame in general, and if shame is something that prevents us from getting help, then that can be problematic. So that's something that comes up as well. This idea of kind of knowing what to do in terms of treatment, but it really being difficult to do that because there's a risk involved for other people finding out about it. So going to a rehab, there's a risk involved for other people finding out about it. Families going to a support group, which is probably one of the best things that they can do. There's a risk involved in people finding out about it. In meetings or recovery meetings, there's a risk involved, so on and so forth. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. But a lot of the risk factors are the same. You know, if I was going to sum it up in a really simple statement, I'd say the risk factors are often the same. The treatment is often the same, but the excuses to get treatment are uniquely Muslim. And it's not a critique of Islam at all, but just our understanding, perhaps our deficient understanding of Islam. Go ahead.
Just a comment. My name is Omar. I'm a family physician.
Great.
I think that drug addiction also in some communities.
Yeah.
Thank you for doing this talk. I really appreciate that. What I found in my practice is majority of people don't realize that the substance they're using is bad. You know, I wish, for example, I'm giving you my family of 6 with kids at home. I'm talking about my childhood. I still remember my mom always told us, you know what, don't smoke. Obviously, cigarettes, you know, people used to smoke a lot in 1980s when I was growing up. Everybody, including unfortunately physicians. So, but she always told us, you know, not to do it, not to do it. I realized in today's community, masajid, imams, people in higher authority that have the role to should be part of the tabligh when they talk in masajid after a Friday sermon, tell people don't do these things. But the constant reminder, especially younger kids, can help them not to be involved in that practice later on. So I see there is a deficiency from parents' standpoint, not emphasizing these aspects when the kids are especially young, between age 6 to 12. After age 12, 13, when they're growing, when they become more independent, it becomes harder to convince them on something. So just a comment, you know what, we do a lot of things, therapy, treatment, medications afterwards, but I have seen, you know what, it is such a evil, difficult thing to treat, and I wish parents had done a better job early on for their kids to support them so that they don't get into future problems.
Thanks for the comment. Yeah, I think there's, I think that's why it's so important. Everybody comes out and has these conversations and we start working on these things as a community. It's great that we are open to have conversations like this and start educating ourselves about these ills and problems. And then more importantly, how do we prevent them and how do we treat them when they do happen? So thanks for the comment. Any other questions? Okay. Sure.
What the doctor just said.
Sure.
Sometimes the parents aren't aware. They think things are very benign. For example, when it seems like a very benign thing for a kid to have during exams. So the I feel that if the parents
What was that? What substance was it?
Red Bull a drink,
Okay, yeah.
which is a high levels of caffeine,
Mhm.
but even that is consumed in a regular basis or
Mhm.
even multi-media facts. So I feel that even the parents also need to be educated about that. We are not familiar with all the drugs that are out there, which are
Mhm.
necessarily very harmful for them to be consumed with one of the other supplements.
Yeah.
Okay? So it's not all about what the kids do, the
Yeah.
parents need understanding of this.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, in terms of prevention, good point. In terms of prevention, what I would say is the good news is we don't need to know all the substances to help prevent these problems. A lot of the protective factors that I discussed didn't require some sort of expert knowledge of all the substances out there. And I'll tell you what, I do this day in and day out and teach about it. I don't know all the substances that are out there. They're constantly changing, evolving to evade legal detection and other things as well. But you know, the good news is a lot of the protective factors, parental child closeness, removing access from substance users and substance use heavy areas, and religious spiritual participation, working on addressing the emotional needs of the child or trauma when it does occur, and other things like that don't require us to know in detail what substances people are using. But what I will say is that if your child, loved one, father, sibling, loved one develops a drug problem, sure. At that point, it's very wise to know a little bit about what drug that they are taking for safety purposes. And we could probably go into that discussion now um, and go from there. Any questions before we do? Go ahead.
I don't know if you're going to answer this later.
Sure.
But I'm interested in knowing some of the signs.
Yeah.
What are the signs to know that someone
Yeah.
is abusing drugs
Sure.
or is on a border or something?
Mhm.
I think most of us would not know.
Yeah, absolutely. Did you have that question as well?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Go ahead. Why don't we, I can answer both of your questions, inshallah.
I wanted to start a conversation about your experience with substance abuse at the collegiate level with Muslim students.
Yeah.
And I wanted to share some background where I'm a sibling of 3,
Mhm.
and all of us spearheaded our MSAs at our
Yeah,
respective,
mashallah.
colleges, but we all lived away from college, and even we couldn't solve substance abuse rampant in our
Mhm.
MSAs.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to ask about your experience if you had any in that arena.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of risk factors, sure. The first question was, what are the signs of somebody using drugs or alcohol? How can we detect somebody that's using drugs or alcohol? And the second question is how to address drug use rampant in college and higher education. First question, you know, again, not necessarily important to know all the signs of every different drug because there's so many out there, it's hard to keep them straight. But it's good to use other barometers of drug use or drug problems. One can be, especially in children, but also adults, a change in friends, a sudden change in personality, and then a sudden decrease in work, school functioning. Those are 3 really good ones. And then again, that requires a really good pulse on your loved one and just kind of continuing to have that open line of communication so that you can detect those things. And then the second question in regards to dealing with drug use that's rampant in colleges, you know, what I hope to do is kind of discuss some of the treatment for people who have a drug problem, and inshallah that'll answer some of your questions. But you know, ideally, there's a couple phases you can think about. One is preventing drug use or regular drug use, so preventing experimentation or preventing experimentation to turn to regular drug use. You can think of that as prevention. And then one is to focus on when drugs become a problem, like an addiction. How do you get treatment that's sufficient enough to tackle that problem? And And then there's a sort of gray area in the middle that we can, inshallah, discuss. But I would say that at the college level, I wouldn't see it being much different. Of course, there's going to be nuances for each person in each area. But you know, that college level, that young emerging adult that's newly coming into their own and finding their independence, the hope is to really help to give them the skills and the emotional positioning to get them in formation to handle those things. The hope is that they're independent enough and able to critically think through problems rationally and not emotionally in order to kind of navigate through that period of time in their life. I mean, there's a lot of focus that can happen prior to them going to college. What I'm going to sort of shift gears towards is the substance use and addiction conversation. And if this doesn't answer the question, then please we'll continue to talk afterwards in the question and answer session. But once drugs become a problem, so when drugs become a problem, you have somebody who is just now has a drug problem. This is a very difficult thing to navigate through. And this absolutely does exist within our community. And like I mentioned, the stakes are high. So overdose death is increasing at rapid rates. So it's very important for us to be equipped with what to do when we encounter this within our own networks and within our own families. And what I want to do is go over what is addiction. So essentially, addiction is a loss of control over their drug or alcohol use. You can think about this as the 4 C's. Somebody continues, the first C being continued use despite consequences. So this is somebody that's doing really poorly in school, doing really poorly at keeping a job, but they, despite swearing off substances, continue to use them. So where a person without an addiction or without a drug problem would kind of tap out and say, this is just too much, I just need to sort of phase out of this and make a change. The person with the drug problem, despite wanting to do that, is still pulled back in. The second C is a loss of control. So people with a drug problem will have that loss of control. So like I mentioned, changes in personality. This isn't the same person that I raised or that I married or that I grew up with, so on and so forth. And then also a loss of control over work, school, crisis, legal consequences, but continued use despite that. The third thing is cravings. So people will have these intense cravings and preoccupation to use substances. So there are a lot of mental real estate in how do I get the drug, almost to the point where they can't hear us. They're not present with us. And then the fourth is compulsion. So just continuing to do it despite not wanting to do it anymore. Something else is driving them. What I want to talk about is when that drug problem happens, for those of you that might have somebody coming up in their mind, what to do about it and how to navigate treatment. Because one of the things that we see is that if we focus on the wrong thing at the wrong time, no traction happens. So, for example, you can think about treatment in 3 phases. You can think of the body, the mind, and then the heart or the lifestyle. The first one being the body. The first stage for many people dealing with the drug problem is to get them away from the drug and allow their body to heal. So they'll go through like a detox phase. So most drugs will have a phase where the body will need to detox from it. So what does that mean? Basically, think of going into a dark room. When you go into a dark room, you can't see anything. So what happens is your pupils will dilate to bring in more light. And then slowly after an adjustment period, you're able to see around you. You're able to see a little bit in the dark. Now what happens is, okay, then you go to sleep, you close your eyes. Then let's say you wake up, somebody wakes you up. Your eyes are still adjusted to what's around you. And then somebody tries to wake you up. They pull the sheets off, open the blinds, and turn the light on. and then what happens? It's like this very painful, uncomfortable feeling. The light hits you, it's almost painful. And then your pupils adjust by decreasing and constricting and taking in less light, and then you're able to focus. Similarly with drugs and alcohol, when they're used over a long period of time, what happens is your body adjusts to it. Your body adjusts to it. It almost becomes dependent on it. And then what happens is if you take that drug or alcohol away, your body will have to go through a period where now it readjusts to not having that drug or alcohol in their system. All right. So that's the first phase, detox. That's just medical care. People need to get medical care for that. So if we're focusing on what do we do about the fact that they're lying? What do we do about the fact that they're manipulating? What do we do about the fact that they're making my life difficult? At that initial phase, it's not the best use of our time. It's not the best high yield use of our time. So if somebody's ready to get treatment, I want to stop, then oftentimes the first step is detox. So drugs like opioids, benzodiazepines, alcohol require a detox period, oftentimes with medications to help the body heal. So for example, benzodiazepines and alcohol particularly can cause death if that withdrawal isn't handled. So I'm going to move on from there. But basically, detox. There's some drugs that don't require detox. The second phase is the mind. The second phase is the mind. So once the body's detoxed from the drug, then what do? Well, at that point, oftentimes people's minds are racing, running. There's a lot of momentum. They've been living this lifestyle on a daily basis. So what's required is the authentic pressing issue at that stage is managing their intense cravings to use drugs and alcohol, managing that distress of life just being raw without any barrier, managing using mental tactics to make it through the first couple of weeks without drugs and alcohol. So this is best done at a program or a place where people can get that professional help of how to teach them that mental jujitsu in order to help wrestle those thoughts, those intense cravings. Now, again, if we focus on this person's having trouble being reliable, this person is lying, this person is manipulating, this person isn't doing what they're saying they're doing, this person, we probably need to educate them on Islam. Don't they know that alcohol and drugs are not allowed, so on and so forth. If we focus on those things at this stage, if we go all in on that, then we're not addressing the pressing issue at that first stage, which is just to allow their body to heal. So their body's not driving them to use drugs and alcohol. So that physical discomfort, which can be intense, isn't driving them to use drugs and alcohol. So the body's the first stage. Then the second phase is the mind. How do they deal with an intense craving when it hits? How do they deal with that intrusive thought to use drugs and alcohol when it occurs? How do they manage that? So again, like if we spend a lot of time talking about how do you manage your checkbook, or how do we get you back into medical school, or how do we get you married, or how do we find lifestyle balance, at that first stage, that second stage, the mind stage, we're not going to get traction. Once they get out of that second stage, then we get to the third stage, which is to maintain all of that. To maintain all of that and have a sense of lifestyle balance and to solidify this new lifestyle and this new change. So that's how we approach this. And oftentimes when we talk about integrating spirituality, and oftentimes when I'm kind of letting you know that I see a lot of people who are able to go through this process and then become really excellent in the practice of Islam and really excellent in their service to humanity. Perhaps I would even argue maybe sometimes even more so than if they hadn't had this problem to set them up for this. They still go through this process. They put everything in its place. First, managing the body. Not all drugs and alcohol need that stage. Some drugs, it's just not that pronounced, the body problem. The detox isn't really needed in a medical setting. But the second phase, where we're intensely dealing with the thinking, That's best done at a rehab, a place where there's no access to drugs or alcohol, where the person's able to kind of have a safe place, but then also intensive therapy and training, basically, on how to manage these assaults, these cravings every time it happens. That can be in a rehab. It could also be at an intensive outpatient program. What that basically means is a rehab is a place you check in, like a residential program is a place where you check in for 30 days, whereas an intensive outpatient program is a place where you can then go home and you go there during the day and you learn those tools. All right. So then the third phase is just kind of integrating back into life. And this is where it's important to maintain what you've learned, but then also start working on relationships, start working on how to balance the checkbook, start working on lifestyle balance, maybe integrate back into work. If school is important, maybe slowly integrating back into school. And then maybe everything at its due time to make sure that we have that success maintained. One of the things that we said, back to your question about kind of specifics within the Muslim community, is oftentimes what we hear about is people that have gone through many treatment cycles, and two sort of pitfalls we see. One is focusing on this being sort of a religious problem in the beginning stages. Of course, there's a morality, ethical component, spiritual component to this, an Islamic component to this. But the idea is to kind of go through these phases in the right time in order to get traction on this problem. Another problem that we see is once the loved one with addiction starts getting traction, and this is what happens a lot, once they start making it happen, they go through the process, first phase, second phase, third phase, right when things are starting to get better, there's just this happens too often, there's this rush to then, let's make it all normal again. Let's make it all happy again. Let's make it all look great on paper again. Let's go show you around. Let's get you back into school. Let's get you a job. Let's get you married. Let's do all of these things. And that's where we see a lot of people fall off. That's where we see a lot of people fall off. But alhamdulillah that people get to that phase, because sometimes we don't see people get to that phase because of a misorganization of what to manage at each of these stages. So that's addiction, and that's a general way of how to approach it and how to make that happen. Before I wrap up, the second thing I wanted to address is family. What's the family's role in all this? And the family has an incredible role. This goes back to your excellent question about what are the common pitfalls within the Muslim community. Family plays an incredible role in this, but if they are not careful, despite their best intentions, families can add to the problem instead of the solution. So despite it being well-intentioned, if we're not really equipped with how to manage and navigate this problem, families can really lock this problem into place. So it's important that families are really well read on how to manage this problem. And it's not something that you can figure out in one conversation. But the best advice that I have to give to family members struggling with a loved one with addiction is to start educating themselves about this problem and start attending groups, start attending classes. It's too complicated to just think that you got it and not have ongoing support, accountability, and coaching to get through this. It's just too complicated of a problem. I'll give you one example. There's the example of getting to the third stage and then really being a block to the loved one with addiction and not a source that helps them continue to go forward. I'll give you one quick example. Supporting versus enabling. So the idea is that this person has a drug problem. My loved one has a drug problem or an alcohol problem. They are having trouble at work. They're having trouble at school. They're having trouble with relationships. Maybe they don't have a place to stay. Support there would not necessarily be then setting them up with a house, setting them up with a job, giving them money to get that back on their feet. That's in essence going to really feed the problem. Because essentially what you're doing is creating the perfect environment for addiction to continue. Because now they have a place where they don't have to worry about focusing on survival. Now they have money where they don't have to worry about, there's no limit now to the drugs they use. They can get drugs and alcohol in the way they were doing before, but now they get more money to be able to do this more, so on and so forth. So the idea is to learn what is enabling the drug use and problem, and what is supporting this person to manage the consequences that they have, and feel those consequences, because sometimes those consequences are the best thing to help motivate people to stop drugs and alcohol. So we don't want to shield them from those consequences and those learning opportunities to then motivate them. So what I see oftentimes is families that will really act to lock the drug use in place. And one of the first things we do at Medina House is, because most often it's a family member that reaches out with, oh, I have a family member with a drug problem. And the family member, when we talk to them, they're ambivalent about treatment. They're just like, whatever, I'm on the phone with you because my parents or my loved one is telling me to talk to you. But the loved ones, they're the ones really seeking a faith-based solution. They're the ones really seeking, how do we manage this problem, so on and so forth. What we do at Medina House is we start to focus on the family. We start to focus on the family, because essentially it's the family's problem. The person with addiction at that point perhaps doesn't feel they have a problem. Maybe because they haven't been able to really feel that problem. So what we do is we start focusing on the family. We use an intervention called CRAFT. CRAFT is an intervention, stands for Community Reinforcement and Family Training. CRAFT has been shown to be effective in getting your loved one into treatment and stopping substances. CRAFT focuses on training the family on how to manage this problem. So if you have a member of your family that's dealing with a drug problem, you can seek out CRAFT as an intervention. There's a website called Smart Recovery that focuses on the family and has really great interventions. It has its CRAFT intervention for friends and family to help them walk them through how to get out of this problem. We also at Medina House, if you go to our website, medinahouse.org, we also offer family groups that are virtual that you can join for Muslims who are trying to navigate through this problem. So you're welcome to join those groups and we can help navigate through this problem. But you don't necessarily need a Muslim solution. Just knowing how to navigate this problem is really important. Okay, so that's that.
Excuse me, what was
Yeah.
the website for CRAFT?
CRAFT is Smart Recovery. So smartrecovery.org. And then we have a website called Medina House, which is MADINA house.org. And you can sign up for family groups through either of those routes. The topic is too long of how to, and the pitfalls are too many to talk about how to navigate through somebody, a loved one that has addiction. So my big advice is to sign up for one of these things, go out of your comfort zone, and start working on this solution, inshallah. And it's not easy, and it's hard to expect our loved ones to change if we're unable to make these commitments. I'm gonna stop here, and so yeah, basically I can tell you a little bit about Medina House since it's come up, and then we'll stop and we'll ask questions. So basically, Medina House is a nonprofit organization where we focus on addiction treatment for underserved populations with a focus on Muslims. So we have a faith-based recovery program, a Muslim recovery program in the Bay Area, in Richmond, California, the Bay Area. And then we also have in Waukegan, Illinois, we have a sober living home. which is about an hour away from here. So, but a sober living home is basically a home where people are able to focus on maintaining the gains that they've made in the first two stages. So they still need that medical treatment and still need to go through that rehab process to stabilize mentally. And then after about a month, they come to our program, our sober living home, and then they stay there for months. You can think about that for weeks to months. You can think about detox as days, rehab as weeks, and our recovery program, our sober living homes in general, as months. And we also offer the family groups that we mentioned as well. And if anybody needs help, they can talk to me afterwards, or they can go directly to our website and submit a question. All right. Does anybody have any questions? Inshallah, we'll start wrapping up. Go ahead.
So you feel like people start with the difference, their background, so can like we
Say the last part one more time. Yeah, great. Excellent question. So the question was, relapse is part of the recovery process. How do we help families to stay motivated through the process? So along with family groups, there's a huge educational process where people are trained at how to navigate through addiction. But there's a huge process of how do we also communicate effectively with this loved one? And then finally, how to keep the hope alive, how to keep self-care up so that we have enough energy in place at the right times. You don't want to burn out. This is a marathon, not a race. You don't want to burn out in the first mile. Otherwise, people won't make it to the end goal. So you want to learn when are the times to sort of coast and wait for them to demonstrate some motivation and action, and when are the times to then put a lot of energy in. And that can be really challenging and confusing to navigate through. So it's good to have more than just our own minds, meaning the group, to get feedback from. Also hear from other people what's worked for them, because that's an excellent source of hope. And then also hear other people that are farther along in the process. That's also an incredible sense of hope. Go ahead.
I agree with you when you said the biggest prevention is start from home, especially because I'm also a therapist and I provide support to families. The biggest question when I think of history is that people don't have time for their kids. And they're too busy. I mean, they take them to schools, they take them to soccer games, but like one-to-one time with your kid and understanding and creating the space where they feel really free to ask any question without any fear. That is the most important.
Absolutely.
We should all stress on.
Absolutely, yeah. Just time with our children is such an incredible protective factor. I completely agree. I mean, it's really surprising when I do have a Muslim patient that's a child. You could almost see the whole circumstances that led up to the problem in the first conversation with the family. You know, like the parents may be super critical in that conversation, or they may be not giving space for the child to speak, or they're just not concerned with the communication, or they're just on two totally different frequencies. Or you hear about their life and you say, the math doesn't add up. Who's even spending time with the child?
Parents are so critical. As soon as they hear about marijuana, first they say astaghfirullah, and it creates so much fear in the child, like he doesn't even approach the parents. So we have to be very cognizant of that fact that don't react and don't be judgmental.
Absolutely. Go ahead.
So does that one group of kids that just use weed to get high? in the Muslim community, do you see people see addiction as a disease?
Yeah, you know, that's a good question. The question is, there's people that kind of experiment with drugs, and then there's people that get addicted. And do we see people seeing addiction as a disease? Absolutely. I think what happens is people will generally go through a process, even Muslims, where they go through a trial and error process, and it's just human nature to want to take the path of least resistance. So when it does become an addiction problem, oftentimes people will start with just trying to kind of manage the situation on their own. And then they might go through a process of not doing well with that, and then introducing some help. And then that's not sufficient, so they introduce more help. The worst thing people can do is just introduce an inadequate amount of help and say, this doesn't work. You know, like, oh, this doesn't work.
My question was,
Yeah.
does the Islamic community see addiction?
Yeah, so you know, it's hard to say that. Yeah, that's a good question. So if your question is like philosophically, does Islam, if there's a disease concept within Islam?
Because the AMA
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
But we don't look at it as a disease, so how are we going to address it?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's benefit in the disease model and really kind of focusing on a solution as opposed to the problem, and bringing it back to providing compassion to the person struggling with addiction and not making it simply a moral problem. And I think that certainly anybody that first encounters this problem, anybody, even addicts themselves, people struggling from addiction themselves, oftentimes when they first encounter this, they see it simply through a moral lens. I steal, I must be bad. Or I lie and cheat, I must be bad. And then they themselves will go through a process of recognizing, well, I don't do this in other dimensions of my life. Or, well, I didn't do this until I started developing a drug problem. The idea is not to simply philosophize on it, but to get to the solution. And the solution is, with the disease model, is not necessarily to completely take responsibility off the person with addiction, but to give them more responsibility. Now you have this syndrome where you can't just walk yourself back out of the problem through the same way you came into it. You can't just reduce drug use. So now you have this problem where certainly brain scans show that there's persistent chemistry changes in the brain, and there's changes in the architecture of the brain and changes in key areas in the brain associated with prolonged substance use. And so the dominant medical theory is the disease model. And the theory prior to that, even with the 12-step movement, was the disease model. And many people use this model and they're successful at it. To say, is this like an Islamically sanctioned thing? I think what I can comment on is that many Muslims will operate with this model and do incredibly well. What I don't see people do well with is if they simply focus on the morality of the issue and not focus on the addiction as a problem. So in other words, the family just says, why are you lying? Why are you not reliable? Why are you manipulating? Why are you not doing these things? Let's educate you on that. Let's continue to bombard you as to why that's shouldn't be done. But no emphasis is put on, let's start figuring out why you use drugs and how to get you to stop. Let's figure out how you use alcohol and how to get you to stop. How can I help? How can I take that energy that I'm using that's not high yield and put it towards, let's say, for example, learning more about addiction and learning more about navigating through the problem. But yeah, I do see Muslims using the brain disease model and and doing well with it. But I think more so just having that compassion to allow themselves to work it out and not simply emphasizing the morality of the issue. Does that make sense? But just Muslims, just like everybody else, they have to go through that trial and error process. You know, anybody recovering from addiction, they go through that process of, first of all, do I even have a problem? And then they go through the process of, let me try the least path of risk. Nobody wants to go check themselves into a rehab for 30 days and bare their souls to complete strangers, or go to detox, or do a family group and risk their relative finding out, or a friend. All these things are incredibly hard. And it requires first an understanding of the problem and experience and seeing what works and what doesn't, and the stakes to be high. Because I mean, if it's low stakes, let's try to get away with it. But when the stakes are high, let's say overdoses entered into the picture, legal issues start entering into the picture, relationship issues start getting real, then oftentimes that's when people start to look a little bit closer. But then again, that's just a very human phenomenon. It's not necessarily a criticism to people or Muslims or individuals. It's just part of the process. Yeah. Right.
Do you believe there's a difference between addiction to controlled substances such as Adderall or the amphetamines or benzodiazepines versus illegal drugs? Do you believe that Islam has something that conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, honestly, I think that Islam has an incredible amount to add to all of these conversations, and we see so much that can benefit. I mean, in a lot of ways, the way the drug problem is first addressed is looking at it as a defect in society, as opposed to simply a defect in the body. Like when these ayats come down, we're talking about stopping drug and alcohol access in the society. And that's incredibly important. Like if we do focus on the individual at the behest of the society, I mean, that's one of the most fascinating things about the drug problem. Like despite all of our research and all of our models, we're still consistently, overdose death consistently increases. We're missing something. But to your question, controlled substances versus illicit substances, really from the way they work on the brain, not really. So let's say you have methamphetamine, which is crystal meth, which is illicit, and then you have amphetamine. Both of these substances, both of these chemicals release dopamine and other neurotransmitters in high amounts in the brain and result in brain changes. Some may have different onsets and other changes to them, but when it comes to addiction, when people start manifesting the behavioral problem of addiction, there's really little difference in what they need to do in order to solve that problem. It's still the same treatment modalities. But what we do see is there's this idea in the rooms of recovery called terminal uniqueness. What we do see is people want to say, I want this culturally adaptive intervention. I want this faith-based intervention. I use amphetamines. I don't use meth. I use alcohol. I'm not like those people that use heroin. So there's this constant sort of, I'm unique. I require a unique solution, and a sort of discounting any treatment options that are out there. So point being is, in terms of treatment, there's really no difference when somebody develops an addiction to a controlled substance versus an illicit substance. Sure, there's differences in perhaps how they obtain those substances, how they function in life. It might look different, the story might be different, but every story is different. Every story is different. You can have really high functioning meth addicted people and really low functioning, let's say Adderall or prescribed stimulant people. So yeah, there are nuances and differences, but in terms of treatment, not really. In terms of what's needed to break the addiction or recover from the addiction, not really. Amphetamines absolutely can cause, so prescribed amphetamines like Adderall can absolutely cause addiction. Prescribed benzodiazepines can absolutely cause addiction. Prescribed opioids can absolutely cause addiction. And we know that because of our current opioid epidemic. One thing I will say, though, is that there's this epidemic of prescribed opioid tablets or counterfeit tablets on the streets being sold in from non-medical sources, like OxyContin or Oxycodone or Norco. That looks exactly like prescribed opioid, but it's not. It's manufactured in an illicit laboratory or illicit ring, and this is incredibly dangerous because they're cut with fentanyl. So long story short, the major difference that I would probably jump to is that if it's prescribed from a doctor and from a pharmacy, then it's regulated. We know what's in it. But if it's from the streets and it's, let's say, powder meth or something like that, or if it's like an opioid tablet that is from the streets, from a non-medical source, but looks just like a regular opioid tablet, that is incredibly dangerous and can contain fentanyl. And we're seeing a lot of overdoses because of that, because of these counterfeit opioid tablets that look like prescribed opioid tablets. Does that answer your question?
Yes. The second part was sonic perspective and the difference between addiction to the illicit drug connection versus controlled substances like opioids.
Well, the general idea is that if something that intoxicates is not needed, then let's say, for example, so first of all, I shouldn't answer this question from like a Shari'i perspective, but from the example of, because I obviously don't, that's not my area, but what I can say is that obviously heroin, fentanyl, and alcohol is prohibited. That's obvious, right? Okay. All right. Now you introduce prescribed opioid tablets or prescribed benzodiazepine tablets. Now, if these intoxicate and you're not using them, let's say prescribed opioids, you're using them for reasons other than pain, other than what they're indicated for. Clearly, you would also agree Islamically, or let's say not Islamically. Let's just say for your own health, it's not a good idea. You would agree that? Okay. So, a lot of times these questions don't even need to be kicked up to, is it Islamically okay or not? Oftentimes, it's just, is it healthy for the person or not? Or is it safe for the person or not? So what I would say, even without having to go and answer that question from that dimension, is that if people are using prescribed opioids and benzodiazepines for reasons other than pain, or for benzodiazepines for reasons other than what they were indicated for, then medically that would not be indicated, and that shouldn't be done. It's incredibly dangerous. So what we have is, we do see people that will be prescribed an opioid for pain, and over a period of time, the pain is less of a problem, but the opioids insidiously also work for emotional stress. And so more and more, you'll see somebody that will use opioids for pain and for reasons other than pain, or they use it for reasons other than pain, like anxiety or mood, or just recreation. But then there's also some pain, but that pain wouldn't necessarily be strong enough to indicate opioids. Does that make sense? Okay.
I think that what I can understand question, there is more like Islamic fraction on questions of a lot of young people are taking marijuana, putting some scholars that it's not common, doesn't come under the definition of common. Also, it's also addictive. But the difference is what is the definition of common, just intoxicant or intoxicating leading to addiction. So many young fellows are drinking marijuana and they are saying that it keeps me focused. I know in my own family, many of you, and they are really having very jobs. Some of them are probably at the community level. They're saying it keeps you focused. So how do you answer that?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I see that's happen a lot in the Muslim community as well, simply because I think there is a larger dynamic of maybe parents not understanding what marijuana is, and children kind of growing up in a society like that doesn't fly oftentimes. If you have somebody whose parents smoke marijuana or experimented in marijuana, and you try to say something like, "It helps me concentrate" or "It helps me perform better," oftentimes that's not going to go too far. Whereas, it's probably these ideas that, oh, I use marijuana because it helps me function better or because it targets this certain symptom. Oftentimes it's just more so a manifestation of just justifying people's substance use, especially if it's addiction.
With the recreational marijuana now legalized in
Yeah.
most of the states.
Yeah.
You know, that, yes, it's a gateway.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a hard question. So if you legalize one substance and you don't legalize another substance, how does this upset the balance of the society in general? So there's medical legalization and then there's recreational legalization that's occurring throughout the U.S. And so, I mean, this really doesn't have any bearing on if it's healthy for a person or not. Because of course, alcohol is legal, nicotine is legal, and all of these cause much death in society and a lot of problems. And it obviously wouldn't have any bearing on if it's Islamically prohibited or not. So, a lot of times this question will come up. And when the question comes up about marijuana, like the question about, oh no, you don't understand, there's this fatwa from this time that it's okay to smoke weed. I don't really entertain that conversation from like a shutting perspective. It's more so a manifestation of perhaps their justification of their substance use. And so like within the Muslim community, obviously we're operating within a community that is voluntarily Muslim and is signing up to not use intoxicants. So for a community that's signing up not to use intoxicants and they hold that as their value, not to use intoxicants, when I speak with them, I see that their cannabis use is conflicting with their values. And what I'm seeing when people say that is an attempt to bridge that dissonance, to bridge that, this is my value, but I smoke cannabis. Here's my logic between the two. So what I do is I usually don't entertain that. I say, well, I go into what is cannabis doing for you and why are we having this conversation? Because obviously the conversation has led to me because it's not working in their life. Does that make sense? Okay, so any other questions?
I did have one last question.
Sure.
You touched on this topic of supporting versus enabling
Mm-hmm.
behaviors and system action, and creating a safe space, for kids. I'm wondering if you want to touch on the parental mindset and any patterns you see in, successful cases versus not successful cases, and parental involvement mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I see as success, defined as success, when I see a family member who brings, let's say, a child or a loved one with addiction to me, what I see as success is them, number one, engaging in family groups, learning the difference between enabling and support, healthy support and unhealthy enabling, and then also continuing to maintain that through the process, because it's not enough to get it right for a month. It's not enough to put down the boundaries and do that for like a month, and then the second month kind of cave. What this requires is a marathon. It's a siege. You have to keep up those boundaries and keep up those tactics for a period of time, and having a group or someone to be accountable or just other Muslims who have been through it, or other people that have been through it, to bounce ideas off of, hey, look, I'm thinking about doing this with my child or my loved one. Does this make sense, or am I crossing the boundaries here, or am I caving here? To have somebody, to have a group or a coach kind of take you through that process, but then also hold you accountable through that long process is absolutely key. The other way I see this work is when the legal system intervenes and pulls the person out of a family, or if life intervenes and pulls the person out of that family, and then they're no longer locked in place with addiction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I want to thank Dr. Amir for giving such an enlightened talk. And we all know that it's very rampant in our community too, but we always put our hands under the sand and always think it's not happening to us, it's always happening to somebody else. So it's good to address that and accept that it is happening in our community. With that, I would like to conclude this session, and I would also encourage people who are here and maybe people who are just listening to seek out services through Family Support Services. We are here to help. And I would like to ask all my volunteers to come forward so people also can see that all of them, we work as a group and we provide this service for the community. And it's a free service, and there's a helpline, and people can call us for any problems. So it's not a what you call crisis line, but people can still get resources and services, and also short-term counseling. FSS members, can you please come? I know you didn't have lunch, but move. Move, please. Yeah, this is all member of my team. And they all have helped us to set up and make this program successful. Thank you.
Thank you.